The other thing that happens to people who achieve great things is that they tend to be born in the right time and at the right place. So that was certainly true of Darwin. He was born at the right time and the right place to take an interest in the origin of species. Because at the time when he was a young man, there was a really important transition going on as regards the timescale of the world and world history in general, thanks to the growth of geology. All right, geology was just really getting underway. And it's quite good to show how that situation developed by actually looking at a group of publications that came out while Darwin was away on the Beagle. So it wasn't his doing, it was taking place around him. And these series of publications I just mentioned are the Bridgewater Treatises, and you can see here's a particular example of one. And they were the result of the will of the Earl of Bridgewater, who died and left some money for a series of treatises. See that first sentence on the power, wisdom and goodness of God as manifested in the creation. So that's what you were asked to study. And so this was work of what was called natural theology, of using the natural world to try and reason about the existence of God and the nature of God and so on. And in particular, one facet of that was the argument from design that said animals are so beautifully designed from the way they live that there must surely be a God who has designed them. So that was one part of the Bridgewater Treatises, but on the other hand, they were also excellent bits of what we would now call popular science. You can see in this one, there's this lovely drawing of a weaver bird, and under the heading of animals, their history, habits and instincts, is a sort of mix of behaviour and ecology, we'd say today. And so this is actually being promoted as something interesting and worthwhile to a reading public. So as well as the theological emphasis, you've also, in that tradition I was mentioning, got a popular science emphasis going on here. Notice also one thing on there, that you'll see the author of this volume is the Reverend William Kirby, so that connection with the church and science, but also notice he is FRS, a Fellow of the Royal Society. So that was not unusual in those days to be a Reverend and to be a Fellow of the Royal Society and write a worthy book. And in his case, Kirby was probably one of the old guard. He writes about how the weaver birds were instructed by the Creator to sow their leaves of plants to make these wonderful nests to protect their eggs and offspring. And he also worried in a few pages, he didn't get worked up about it, but he did worry about recent work that was coming to light that revealed an age of reptiles, as it was called. In the 1820s, people had discovered what we now call dinosaurs and plesiosaurs and animals like that, and they said, oh, there was an age of reptiles before the age of mammals in which we live. And so there was beginning to be this picture of the world changing rapidly. And he thought that wasn't quite consistent with Genesis, and he worried about that. But here's the animal he worried about. Plesiosaurus was one of the ones that existed in former times, is now clearly extinct. Some people have tried to dob in the Loch Ness Monster as a surviving plesiosaur, but without success. So it's definitely extinct. It doesn't exist anymore. It existed back then. Oh, notice again who restored Plesiosaurus, the Reverend W. Conybeare. And the person who wrote the book in which this appears was another Bridgewater treatise published the very next year after Kirby's, the Reverend William Kirby, who was the first person to teach geology at the University of Oxford. Oxford, I have to admit, was not as receptive to science as Cambridge at that time, but he managed, and he wrote this beautiful book. It's absolutely superb, and it makes 2 points very clearly. One is that fossils like this show there have been big changes in the history of the Earth, including extinctions. So whole faunas have disappeared, and that was accepted by that time. The other significant point that is quite clear is that this didn't happen overnight, but that clearly vast periods of time were involved in these sorts of changes. Okay, so the big changes, and they take a lot of time, was what was accepted in William Buckland's book. Now, not everybody agreed as to how this happened, and Buckland acknowledges that, but in one place he says, allowing that people disagreed over what the causes of geological phenomena were, he says, the truth is that all observers are now agreed in admitting the lapse of very long periods of time to have been an essential condition to the production of these phenomena. All right, so all observers mean everyone who actually did some geology agrees that very long periods of time, and later in the book he uses the phrase millions of years. So what you see there is by the time Darwin got back from the Beagle voyage, people who were expert in geology accepted that big changes had happened, including whole faunas going extinct, and that this involved vast periods of time. And that was a significant shift in science. Okay, and if you'd just gone back into the late 18th century, you wouldn't have found that view. By the middle of the 19th century, it was well established. Now, there's an interesting link with Darwin here, because when he went off on the Beagle voyage, he took with him the first book by a youngish man called Charles Lyell on the principles of geology. And this was an excellent book, but it challenged some of the ideas that were conventional and in Buckland's book. So Henslow, his friend Henslow, advised him to take Lyell's book with him, but said on no account believe the views therein advocated. So I love that piece of advice. Take this book, but just don't believe it. But Darwin did. The first time he stopped on the voyage and got a chance to do some geology, he realized the great superiority, as he put it, of Lyell's way of viewing the world of geology. He could see how if you looked at sequences of rocks that faced you, you could see gradual changes taking place. And sorry, I may not have made that quite clear, is one of the changes that Lyell, as well as reviewing the state of geology, he argued that changes had happened gradually, whereas up to then the consensus that Buckland and others accepted was that there'd been big revolutions. So between the age of reptiles and the age of mammals, there was a sudden revolution. Lyell said, no, if you look at the fossil record carefully and think about how much time's available, all these things actually happened ticking over gradually. Now, Lyell produced a volume 2 in 1832, which eventually caught up with Darwin on the Beagle, and in that volume he specifically looked at the nature of species. Because, you see, he was interested in species as geological markers and of their going extinct, so he needed to know a bit. And he felt comfortable with the prevailing view that species were real entities, but they were stable and really didn't change. So he said, you've got real things here, species, and basically they don't change much. But if you look at the geological record, what you see is the circumstances, the geology gradually changing, and as the geology gradually changes, the species gradually go extinct. Okay, so gradual change, species as definite entities, and when the conditions change so that it doesn't suit them anymore, bye-bye species. So what he's saying is you can see the gradual disappearance of species in the fossil record. But of course what that does is to implicitly raise the question, well then where do the new species come from? Okay, if the old ones disappear, what about the new ones? And he really shuffled his feet on that one. He didn't provide an answer, and his critics got to him for that. What he did do was actually to carefully review Lamarck's theory of evolution. Again, he respected Lamarck. By the way, it was Lamarck who coined the term biology, and so here was this important biological theory, but he considered Lamarck had not made his case. So it raised the question, well then, where do these new species come from? If the old ones are gradually popping off, what happens to the new ones. And there's a lovely bit of correspondence that took place between him and Sir John Herschel, who was an astronomer by profession. Well, wasn't a profession back then, but he was certainly an astronomer. But he also went into for the philosophy of science and looked at what laws of nature are and what kind of work do you need to do to establish a law of nature in science. And so he thought about that in the context of his day. And he wrote to Lyell a letter from South Africa in 1836. And he talked about that mystery of mysteries, the replacement of extinct species by others. All right, so other experts in science immediately cottoned on to this implicit question that Lyell's excellent discussion raised, and he called it that mystery of mysteries, a phrase that Darwin later used in a couple of books. And then he goes on to talk about it in the theological context of the day, about the work of the Creator, and he says, in this, as in all his other works, we are led by all analogy to suppose that the Creator operates through a series of intermediate causes. And so the origin of fresh species, could we ever know it, would be found to be a natural rather than a miraculous process. Okay, so here's a guy who was one of the leading figures in Britain in the day, a respected scientist, saying, surely we would expect, from all points of view, both theological and scientific, that new species would arise by natural processes. But he quickly adds, although we perceive no indications of any process actually in progress which is likely to issue in such a result. See, and that's a nice one, because Lyell's whole thing was you can explain geology, what happened in the past, by looking at processes that are happening now, and when you see what's happening now, you can work out how they caused whatever happened in the past. Not so with species, this guy's saying. We don't know of anything that's happening now that would lead to the origin of species. So what this means that's rather nice is that by the time Darwin got home, oh, and I should have told you, he met Sir John Herschel in South Africa, where Herschel was doing astronomical observations. When the Beagle stopped there, naturally enough, gentleman met gentleman, and so he met up with Sir John and had a chat. So you would think it was certainly would have heard that view, and anyhow that letter was published later on. So when Darwin came back, the origin of species was actually, or the species question as it was called then, was a lively topic of discussion, not in society at large, but in the scientific circles in which he moved. And Darwin, because of his developed expertise on the Beagle voyage, was immediately introduced to that circle of scientists and distributed his material round about. And when he got the results back, that's when he became convinced of evolution. Contrary to the myth, he didn't have a eureka moment on the Galapagos, but it was as people handed him his results, including the birds on the Galapagos, that he reckoned, this is best explained by one species giving rise to another. And one nice example that he lists in his autobiography that helped him to make that step was the resemblance between fossil species and living species in South America. This is a drawing of a giant sloth by the anatomist Richard Owen, and it's not actually the one that Darwin discovered. Darwin discovered another specimen of Mylodon that was much less complete, and Richard Owen duly named it Mylodon darwini. But this is another one, a giant one, and if you look in the corner, you can actually see a little drawing of a living sloth showing you how much bigger the extinct one is. But basically, they're built on the same plan, and so, as Owen said, both in South America and in Australia, you see this tendency for the giant extinct species to closely resemble the living ones. Darwin immediately decided that it made sense. That was about March 1837, you probably know this story, and he started writing notebooks on the transmutation of species, which was the phrase used for evolution a lot in those days. And then he realized that it was not just enough he was well versed in the idea that you had to explain evolution, not just say, oh yes, that must happen. And he looked for an explanation that would explain how species became so well adapted. How did new species fit into their environment? And he was toying with the ideas that you could derive from domestic breeding when he read Malthus on population. Now that was an old capitalist book from the late 18th century that has a strangely modern ring, because what Malthus said is, well, there are too many people on the planet and not enough resources, and humans have the potential to grow exponentially in numbers, and that means there's going to be a nasty struggle for existence. Heard that message anywhere recently? So this was back in 1800, Malthus was saying this, and Darwin said, of course, if that's true of humans, think how much more it's true of animals that breed so much faster, and so there would be a struggle for existence, and any variation that gives its owner a slight advantage is going to be preserved, and if it's heritable, handed on. So he started working seriously and produced a couple of preliminary essays, one in 1842, one in 1844. And so you might think he was well on the way to publishing The Origin of Species in 1849, but then events overtook him in the shape of this little book, The Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. If you look very carefully, it's not because you haven't had dinner, it's because there really is no author on the title page of this book, and that's because it was written by Robert Chambers, who was a publisher. You may possibly have heard of Chambers' Encyclopedia, and he was worried that being known as the author of such a book would be bad for business. And what this did was to advocate evolution as being obviously making sense of the accumulating data. And he saw it as a divinely ordered process, this is how God worked in producing new species, and it was an absolute popular sensation. If you've got very sharp eyes, you can see that fourth edition is published in 1845, and the first edition was in 1844. That is success by any standards in publishing. But it was inaccurate and careless. For example, one would hardly take its ideas very seriously when he proposed that mammals evolved from birds by way of a duck-billed platypus. So there was a great storm, but the experts just condemned it and dismissed its conclusions. And the effect it had on Darwin was that he saw the need to produce a work in an entirely different class. Okay, he wasn't quite ready to publish then anyway, but from the furore that this got and the abuse that he got as a rank amateur author, Darwin realized he had to do better than that. And that's when he took up the study of barnacles. It's rather nice that actually started from a little barb from his friend Hooker, who was a botanist and in charge of Kew Gardens. And Hooker got fed up, actually not with the vestiges, but with some French philosopher, and he wrote to Darwin, oh, really, no one's got any business to publish on species unless they've actually described a lot for themselves. And Darwin said, ouch. Because he realized that although he'd done plenty of geology and was really working on it and interested, he hadn't actually done any species descriptions of his own. What started him on barnacles was he had one specimen left over from the Beagle voyage, which was remarkable. I'm sure you all know what a barnacle is. If I ask you, you'll tell it's one of those little crustaceans that live in a shell attached to the rocks on the beach. But Darwin found one that had no shell. Instead, the naughty creature bored its way in through the shell of a mollusk and made itself at home inside. Not content with that, the animals that he found were all females, and the miserable little males actually lived inside the female. So if you're a man of enlarged curiosity, who could not be interested in saying, what's going on here? And so he got stuck into barnacles, and people encouraged him. They said, of course, now if you studied a greater group of barnacles, you'd understand this better. And then someone else said to him, of course, really it's time that someone described all the barnacles that we knew. So that took up 8 years. It improved his reputation, but it also gave him great insight into variability. He hadn't really much insight to that in the essays, but this showed him there's lots of variation in natural populations. So it was a great help in that respect. Also, there were other studies going on. While Darwin was taken up with that, he wasn't completely out of touch, and there were other people who were going on building the work. And just to give one example, just to the same anatomist, this looked a bit vague, but it's a book on vertebrates by Richard Owen, and in particular, that same anatomist, on the nature of limbs. And what he's done is, this is a fold-out plate, and I think you can probably just see the creases, and if you count them up, you can see you've actually got to fold it out 6 times to make this huge plate. And what he's done is, you've got a picture of the skeleton of all the main groups of vertebrates, ourselves, birds, mammals, reptiles, fish. And what he showed is that basically all vertebrates are built on a common plan, and that was an idea that was already around there, but he proved it with this marvellous detail. And he called, in the top right-hand corner, that basic plan the archetype. And of course, when Darwin came to write The Origin, he just said archetype equals ancestor. Owen actually hinted at that idea, but it's so well hidden that Darwin missed it. So here was the sort of evidence of a different kind, building up, as Darwin was stuck on his barnacles. Then the next significant step was of a young man called Alfred Wallace. And I do like Wallace. He was a real young man in a hurry, but of a gentle nature and full of enthusiasm. He'd actually read the Vestiges and said, yes, it's all right, but the job needs to be done properly. Okay, he got the same message. He went off to South America, again, someone else did that. The only trouble was on the way back, his boat sank, caught fire and sank, taking most of his specimens with it. Fortunately, he survived and went off to Asia. And this is where he published a paper in a British magazine on the law which has regulated the introduction of new species. See, and that was very much in keeping with the advice that Herschel was giving. You try and make out a law which describes what's going on, and then you try and work out the cause for it. And what Wallace picked out was that if you compare geographical distribution with geological distribution, then similar species are found close together in space and close together in time. What he'd already worked out, of course, was that obviously suggests that one has evolved from the other. But he didn't say so in this. He was being very careful to be descriptive. But he made it clear that he was looking at some such idea, because in one bit of the paper he says the present condition of the organic world is clearly derived by a natural process of gradual extinction and creation of species from that of the latest geological periods. Darwin missed the point because he used the phrase creation, but if he said a natural process of creation, and Darwin had become close friends with Charles Lyell, who didn't miss the point. He rushed off to Down House and said, this guy's going to beat you, get in there first if you don't write something quick. He said that I can see where he's going, you better get a move on. Poor old Darwin, after all this time, he started to write a quick essay, and he couldn't bring himself to do so. No, I can't do that. So he started to write this huge tome on the origin of species, and he got through 11 chapters. And I've actually got that one at home, and it's even bigger than the origin of species. But it was only halfway through, full of references and data and impossible, when Wallace's second paper arrived, in which he'd actually come up with the same idea. He'd read Malthus and said, of course, that's what's going to happen to natural species, and that's how adaptation will come about. He scribbled off this little paper when he'd recovered from a fit of malaria and posted it off to Darwin, who he knew to be working on species, and said, Darwin, my friend, what do you think of this? I thought, Fortunately, Darwin's friends Lyell and Hooker came to the rescue, and Wallace's paper was published with a piece by Darwin in 1858, and Darwin was finally needled into writing The Origin of Species. So, we finally got to there by this route, and what really contributed to the success of this book, why you've seen that other people had a go at evolution, hinted at it there, published a speculative notion, whatever, was that it was, as Darwin described, one long argument which effectively answered the species question. All right, the species question had been sort of humming away there in the professionals. Darwin produced this brilliant long argument that effectively gave you the answer. And it was skillfully aimed at his fellow naturalists. He'd been in the system long enough that he knew exactly the sort of queries that would trouble them, the sort of information that they would want, and he assembled this, in the limited space, a huge amount of the recent data, like Owen's archetypes and all sorts of the fossil discoveries. They all were brought together beautifully. And of course, last but not least, I said in the space available, one of the chief benefits of The Origin is that it's nice and short. If he'd actually got to finish his great big tomes, I bet you that hardly anyone would have read it, whereas The Origin of Species is something that you can knock off in an evening. I think it was his friend Huxley who read it while supervising an exam and said to himself, how extremely stupid not to have thought of that. But if I can just mention one other thing, is that first of all, is that it was successful. There's no doubt about that. It convinced the naturalists, and Darwin, in the 6th edition in 1872, comparing back to the first edition that was not entirely friendly received, he could say, now things are wholly changed, and almost every naturalist admits the great principle of evolution. Okay, so that was true. Evolution carried the day because he just made such a convincing case for it where no one had before. But the bit that didn't carry the day was natural selection. And Darwin devoted quite a bit of space to that based on the study of domestic breeding, particularly pigeons. Fancy pigeons were a great hobby back then. There was lots of domestic breeding, and he used that as an analogy for natural selection. So he's saying, just as some variations chance to pop up and we select them for some breed we want, in the same way, in nature, some useful variation chances to pop up, and then that is selected for and helps that species improve. And that was a concept that people actually found very hard to grasp in the 19th century. It involved working at different levels in a way that people were not used to. And you can see this. One nice example I have of it is the lengthy discussions of letters that went to and fro between him and Lyell in 1860 and 61. And all that correspondence is now available online, and it's a treat sometimes to dip into it, because it's just like reading emails between friends. What about this? What about that? What about that? And you can see them going to and fro, and he can't convince Lyell of the workability of natural selection. And in particular, this business about random variations, which is not what Darwin said, really confused people. I'd just like to wind up this presentation by saying, really, what a great contribution The Origin of Species made. Darwin got to it by that rather roundabout route, but the end product was worth waiting for. As his American friend Asa Gray said to him, 20 years is not too long a time to produce such a book in. But the encouragement that I particularly like is recalled from a physiologist, Sir Charles Sherrington, who in 1873 was persuaded by his mother to take The Origin of Species with him on his summer holiday. You wouldn't normally think that was so, but the word she used to persuade him was, she said, it sets the door of the universe ajar. And to me, that sums it all up. I think that says it all. Darwin's significance as a key thinker is because his work sets the door of the universe ajar. Thank you.